So I have with me our resident expert, Nick Lambe. Nick, we saw obviously a lot of press attention to the global ransomware attacks that hit the NHS. Do you think the criticism of the NHS was unfair?
The criticism, broadly speaking, wasn't unfair. And unfortunately, they have a degree of culpability on three levels on this. The first is that they're without question running systems that are archaic. They're not up to the date. They shouldn't really be in operation. I'll pick on Windows XP as an example. That went out of service with Microsoft support in 2014. Now, to actually have business critical systems running on software and operating systems that are out of support is just not smart. It goes beyond not smart. It is leaving you vulnerable, both from a security standpoint and from an operational standpoint. I think that we shouldn't get into the debate on cost and viability of what people can afford. The question that really needs to be asked is, can you afford not to update to appropriately secure systems? The second issue where there is an element of culpability is that even with this knowledge that they are operating obsolescent systems, there were enough warnings and alerts over the last 6 weeks about vulnerabilities around the SMB exploits, with possible ways to solve it, including lockdowns of ports on firewalls, that again, for that not to have been done by the IT service providers, be it outsource or insource, is just not on. The final point that where I think unfortunately a lot of the blame is going to be levied, and whilst it is valid, it's not the primary issue, is that staff need to be trained and more educated about don't click on unknown links and all the usual good process and good practice about email monitoring and management, so you don't make yourselves vulnerable.
Okay, Nick, so given the nature of these attacks, were these professionals or amateurs, in your opinion?
The definition of what's a professional and what's an amateur is an interesting boundary, but it certainly wasn't government actors, that is for sure. But how professional up the road we go in organised crime is perhaps a point for debate another time. There's certainly some evidence starting to come out that whereas in the initial stages of the attack, this looked like a straightforward, low-grade criminal ransomware that had just gone viral, it's now starting to look as though there are certain similarities to the Lazarus Group, which have got associations to North Korea. And I'm sure the information around that will unfold over the coming weeks and months. You've got to bear in mind that if you are hitting this number of organizations at this level and getting this level of commercial return, which is the way the criminals will think about it, it can't be seen as amateur. It is organized, but certainly of the criminal fraternity.
Thanks, Nick. With the nature of this attack, it was on a very old operating system, Windows XP. What do you think is the next round of ransomware vulnerability that people should be starting to prepare for?
I think rather than perhaps focusing on the actual technical exploit, because whatever anybody is going to predict, you can almost guarantee that the bad guys are going to come up with something different, because that's the nature of the beast. What we should really be looking at is our basic principles of making it as difficult as possible for the bad actors to actually exploit this. The one certainty is that this is a highly lucrative set of commercial opportunities for organised crime. I think it's worth making point that in the press, people are referencing making a big deal out of this $300 of Bitcoin and we'll unencrypt your device. If you look at that in context, just to the NHS, I believe the figure is in excess of 70,000 devices were affected. 70,000 times $300 is an awful lot of cash if somebody was to pay that ransom. So we've got to be aware that this is something that is going to continue, and it's probably going to increase, because whilst you start off with a niche criminal, it then, if it becomes a route to make money, you start to go wider. In the conventional world, go back a few years and look at the fad of ram raiding fronts of shops. Somebody came up with a good/bad idea, and then suddenly everybody wanted to put a van into the front of a plate glass window.
So governments seem to be putting a brave face and a gloss on things. Are they perhaps in part to blame for what happened with the NHS and in general?
A specific government, that's a harder question to answer, but as a general comment, governments have got to take a very, very serious look at their policy in relation to not only the security in terms of what they're doing to protect their country, their citizens, their businesses, but also, are they creating vulnerabilities themselves? And what we mean by that is that this exploit, if you go back to its origin source, some mileage has been made of it in the press, that it came out of the shadow brokers break from the NSA. The Eternal Blue exploit was then modified. The criminals got their hands on it. They created the WannaCry tool that has now been deployed. If you draw that back to its origin, this was a relatively low level thing that probably could have been worked out from first principles. However, the exploits themselves that governments are wanting to keep for what they perceive as legitimate reasons, counterterrorism, serious organised criminality, etc., are they actually creating more problems than they're solving by leaving these backdoors and these vulnerabilities open? Because as we've seen, security is not what it used to be. It's certainly in the digital arena. A phrase that is starting to circulate on the internet, and it's one worth thinking about, is there perhaps time now for the discussion around some kind of government-to-government arrangement along the lines of a digital Geneva Convention, where governments recognise that certain cyber weapons and digital weapons are actually too dangerous to have in existence, in the same way as we deal with chemical and biological weapons under the Geneva Convention. It's a think piece. I'm certainly not advocating it, but I think it needs discussing.
Thanks, Nick. Any sage advice for ordinary businesses and organisations out there in terms of the defences and countermeasures they need to consider in the wake of this this series of attacks?
Unfortunately, I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record here, but there are three key things that every business, every individual should do. Number one, use virus checking software, use firewalls, and make sure that your operating systems and all your software is patched up to the latest standard. That last statement about patching to the latest standard is the crux of why this actually worked the way it did and why WannaCry was so dangerous, because it exploited unpatched and unpatchable systems. Second thing is, if you have got those systems in place, make sure that you run backups. Regular automated backups are now very simple to do, preferably on a separate device or environment, and encrypt and protect that backup yourselves, so that in worst case, you blow your laptop, rebuild it, and download your backed up service. Yes, you may lose a bit of data, but you're back to where you were yesterday or the day before. Third, and finally, is follow all the basic protocols and basic processes of don't click on unknown links, don't open emails that have come from unknown sources, use your spam checkers and block out anything that is vulnerable, and also report it. If you think you're vulnerable from public sector phishing, report it back to the public sector agencies, which are all accessible online.
Is there perhaps another strategy that businesses should consider? Because we're in the era of cloud applications. So in theory, a business could move away from having a local computer that's vulnerable to attack, or just have a very basic platform, but plug into an accounting system that's on the cloud, a CRM that's on the cloud, email that's on the cloud, so that the risk is spread out. And the ownership of the problem of backup is with the the service provider. Would that be a plausible strategy for a lot of organizations?
It is a plausible strategy. The important thing to bear in mind, though, is that the same basic principles still apply. That if you're accessing the cloud, you've got to access it through a device. In the future, I think the migration from the differentiation between phones to laptops to desktops to business systems is going to blur. But we're going to use a device that must be kept up to date in terms of its security status and its patching state. That will access your primary data environment, which may or may not be vulnerable, depending on how clever the bad guys are. Therefore, you still need to have an alternate location backup and backup plan, which is protected separately from your primary data. Now, some people will want to do that strategy in a physical environment. Some people are completely trusting and happy to do it on the cloud. Some people want to split it between the two. You have your backup on the cloud, and you have your primary on physical, or you have your primary on cloud and your backup on physical. All of the above strategies are appropriate, so long as you've got those components in place.
And finally, Nick, when these people get caught, what should happen to them?
Don't get me started on that one.
Let's hope they do get caught. Nick, that's been a fabulous review. Some good analysis, some sage advice as always. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.